Solomon Islands, November 13, 1942, 0200 hours, and Rear Admiral Hiroaki Abe, commanding Battleship Division 11, peered through the darkness toward Savo Island, where his force of 2 battleships, the mighty Hiei and her sister Kirishima, supported by light cruiser Nagara and 11 destroyers, prepared to unleash 14-inch shells on Henderson Field. The Japanese admiral had every reason for confidence that night, commanding battleships that displaced 36,600 tons each, armed with 8 14-inch guns, and protected by armor that could withstand anything the Americans could throw at them. But Abe didn't know that earlier that day, aircraft from a ship the Imperial Japanese Navy had already reported destroyed 3 times had landed at Henderson Field, and those pilots from USS Enterprise CV-6 were preparing to extract revenge at first light. Within 24 hours, Hiei would become the first Japanese battleship lost in the war, sent to the bottom by bombs and torpedoes from the aircraft carrier that Japanese commanders had nicknamed the Gray Ghost, the ship that refused to die no matter how many times they announced her destruction. The USS Enterprise, hull number CV-6, was not supposed to survive the war, at least not according to every calculation made by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, who had meticulously planned the destruction of American carrier forces in the Pacific. This Yorktown-class aircraft carrier, commissioned May 12, 1938, displaced 19,800 tons, stretched 809 feet 6 inches in length, and carried up to 90 aircraft in her hangars and on her flight deck. Her crew complement of 2,919 officers and men operated 8 5-inch 38 caliber guns for anti-aircraft defense, though these weapons would prove less important than the ship's uncanny ability to survive. The Japanese High Command had identified Enterprise as a primary target from the first day of the war, and for good reason, because this single ship would ultimately account for 911 enemy aircraft destroyed, 71 ships sunk, and 192 vessels damaged or destroyed, a combat record that no other warship in history could match. December 7, 1941, should have been Enterprise's death day, according to the meticulous planning of Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, commander of the Kido Butai, the mobile strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had tracked American carrier movements for months, and their intelligence indicated Enterprise should have been moored at Pearl Harbor that Sunday morning, sitting helpless as 353 Japanese aircraft descended on the Pacific Fleet. But fortune, weather, and what some called divine providence had intervened, as Enterprise was returning from delivering Marine Fighter Squadron 211 to Wake Island when she encountered rough seas that delayed her arrival. Task Force 8, under Vice Admiral William Halsey, was still 215 miles west of Oahu when Commander Mitsuo Fukuda led the first wave of Japanese attackers over Pearl Harbor, and this stroke of luck would haunt Japanese naval planning for the next 4 years. The frustration began immediately for Japanese commanders when 18 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise arrived over Pearl Harbor during the attack, and those 7 were shot down with 8 airmen killed. The carrier herself remained untouchable at sea. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving reports in his flagship Nagara anchored in Hashirojima Bay, absorbed the news that all 3 American carriers had escaped destruction with characteristic stoicism, but privately he understood the implications. Years earlier, he had warned the Japanese government about America's industrial capacity, stating that he could run wild for 6 months to perhaps a year, but had no confidence in ultimate victory if the war dragged on, and the survival of Enterprise and her sisters Lexington and Saratoga meant the Americans retained their most potent striking force in the Pacific. 3 days after Pearl Harbor, Enterprise drew first blood when her aircraft located and sank the submarine I-70 on December 10, 1941, making her the first American ship to sink a Japanese warship in the Pacific War. This seemingly minor victory sent ripples through the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force, which had expected to operate with impunity in Hawaiian waters, picking off damaged American vessels and merchant shipping. The loss of I-70 with all hands demonstrated that despite the devastating blow at Pearl Harbor, American carrier aviation remained lethal, and Enterprise in particular seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to appear where least expected. Commander Taman Yamaguchi, one of Japan's most aggressive carrier commanders, would later remark that Enterprise seemed to have a sixth sense for avoiding Japanese forces while simultaneously appearing to strike at the most inopportune moments. The Japanese Navy's opportunity for revenge seemed to arrive during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons on August 24, 1942, when aircraft from the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku finally found Enterprise operating north of Guadalcanal. Vice Admiral Nobite Kondo, commanding the Japanese force, received reports that his pilots had scored 3 direct bomb hits and 4 near misses on the American carrier, causing massive fires and heavy casualties. 74 Americans died and 95 were wounded as 250-kilogram bombs tore through Enterprise's flight deck and exploded deep within her hull. Japanese pilots returning to their carriers reported the American ship dead in the water, listing heavily, abandoned by her escorts. Radio Tokyo announced that evening that the carrier Enterprise had been destroyed in a glorious victory for the Emperor's forces, and sake flowed freely in the wardrooms of the combined fleet. But Enterprise's damage control parties, trained to exhaustion in the months before the war, performed miracles that day, containing fires, shoring up damaged bulkheads, and somehow keeping their ship operational even as flames threatened to detonate aviation fuel and ammunition stores. Captain Arthur Davis and his crew refused to abandon their ship, and within hours Enterprise was making 24 knots, launching and recovering aircraft, very much alive despite Japanese claims. When Japanese search planes found only empty ocean where a burning wreck should have been, bewildered commanders began referring to the American carrier as a ghost ship, something that defied the normal laws of naval warfare. The Gray Ghost legend was born, though few Japanese officers found comfort in the supernatural explanation for their failure. Admiral Yamamoto, studying battle reports at his headquarters, understood the implications better than most of his subordinates. The Americans had lost the carrier Lexington at Coral Sea and Yorktown at Midway, leaving Enterprise and Saratoga as their only operational carriers in the Pacific, but somehow these 2 ships seemed to appear everywhere, striking Japanese positions from the Solomons to the Gilberts. When Saratoga was torpedoed on August 31, 1942, and Wasp was sunk on September 15, Enterprise stood completely alone as America's only operational carrier in the Pacific, facing the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy's still formidable carrier force. German naval attaché reports from Tokyo during this period noted the confidence in Japanese naval circles that one carrier could not possibly hold back the combined fleet, yet somehow Enterprise continued to appear wherever American forces needed air support. The Battle of Santa Cruz on October 26, 1942, should have been Enterprise's final battle according to every Japanese tactical assessment. Admiral Nagumo, still smarting from his losses at Midway where Enterprise's dive bombers had helped destroy 4 Japanese carriers including Akagi and Kaga, commanded a powerful force built around the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, supported by the light carriers Zuho and Junyo. Against this armada, the Americans could muster only Enterprise and Hornet, and Japanese pilots were specifically briefed to ensure neither American carrier survived the engagement. Lieutenant Commander Mamoru Seiki, leading the strike from Shokaku, personally selected Enterprise as his target, determined to avenge the carriers lost at Midway where Enterprise's air group had played such a devastating role. The Japanese achieved tactical success at Santa Cruz, sinking Hornet and again damaging Enterprise with 2 bomb hits that killed 44 men and wounded 75 others. Captain Osborne Hardison, who had assumed command just 5 days earlier, watched as Japanese Val dive bombers bore down on his ship despite the wall of anti-aircraft fire thrown up by Enterprise and her escorts including the new battleship South Dakota. Once again, Radio Tokyo announced the destruction of Enterprise, and this time they had good reason to believe their claims. Japanese pilots reported hitting the carrier with at least 2 250-kilogram bombs, starting major fires, and leaving her dead in the water. The Emperor himself was informed that American carrier aviation in the Pacific had been eliminated, leaving Japanese forces free to operate without fear of air attack. But Enterprise's crew had become experts at resurrection, and despite serious damage, she remained operational, taking aboard aircraft from the doomed Hornet and maintaining combat air patrols over American forces. When Japanese reconnaissance aircraft searched for the wreckage the next day, they found only empty ocean, and commanders began to speak in hushed tones about the American ghost ship that could not be killed. The psychological impact on Japanese naval aviation was profound, as pilots who had claimed definite kills on Enterprise began to doubt their own observations, wondering if the American carrier possessed some secret armor or damage control system that made her unsinkable. In reality, Enterprise's survival came from her crew's determination and skill, with damage control parties working through flames and flooding to save their ship time and again. The Italian Navy, monitoring Pacific operations from their headquarters in Rome, noted in their intelligence summaries the remarkable survival rate of USS Enterprise compared to British carriers in the Mediterranean, which seemed far more vulnerable to air attack. Admiral Angelo Iacchino, commander of the Italian battle fleet, studied American damage control techniques with interest, particularly Enterprise's ability to resume flight operations within hours of suffering seemingly catastrophic damage. German naval observers in Tokyo reported growing concern among their Japanese counterparts about the psychological effect the Gray Ghost was having on their pilots, who began to approach attacks on American carriers with less confidence, wondering if their bombs and torpedoes would have any effect on the apparently indestructible Enterprise. November 1942 brought Enterprise to Guadalcanal, where she became the sole American carrier supporting the desperate fighting for Henderson Field. On November 13th, her Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers located the damaged battleship Hiei north of Savo Island, where Rear Admiral Abe had retreated after his disastrous night engagement with American cruisers and destroyers. The Japanese battleship, pride of the Imperial Navy, had survived countless engagements since her commissioning in 1914 and modernization in the 1930s, but Enterprise's Avengers pressed home their attacks with devastating accuracy. Combined with strikes by Army B-17 flying fortresses from Henderson Field, Enterprise's aircraft delivered between 5 and 8 torpedo hits and numerous bomb strikes that left Hiei burning and helpless. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving reports of Hiei's loss at his headquarters aboard Battleship Yamato, exploded in rare public anger, not just at losing Japan's first battleship of the war, but at the identity of her killer. Enterprise again, always Enterprise, the ghost ship that haunted every Japanese naval operation in the Pacific. He relieved Admiral Abe of command and forced his retirement, though privately Yamamoto knew the real problem was not his commanders but the seemingly supernatural ability of one American carrier to appear wherever needed most. The psychological impact rippled through the combined fleet as sailors and airmen began to speak of Enterprise in almost mythical terms, a phantom that materialized from nowhere to strike before vanishing into the vast Pacific. The next night, November 14th, Enterprise's aircraft struck again during the naval battle of Guadalcanal, joining Marine Avengers from Henderson Field in attacking the heavy cruiser Kamikaze and transport ships attempting to reinforce Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. When the smoke cleared after 3 nights of savage fighting, Enterprise had shared in sinking 16 ships and damaging 8 more, virtually destroying Japanese hopes of retaking Guadalcanal. Captain Tamichi Hara, commanding destroyer Matsukaze during the battle, later wrote that the appearance of Enterprise aircraft at dawn seemed like demons rising from hell, striking Japanese ships that had survived the night surface actions only to face destruction from above. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, a staff officer with the Japanese Naval Air Forces, calculated that Enterprise alone had accounted for more Japanese aircraft destroyed than any 3 other American ships combined. By early 1943, her tally stood at over 400 enemy planes destroyed, either by her fighters or anti-aircraft guns, along with dozens of ships sunk or damaged. The mathematics were stark and undeniable. One American carrier was inflicting losses equivalent to what an entire fleet should barely manage, and Japanese naval planners began to factor Enterprise's probable appearance into every operation, knowing that wherever they struck, the Gray Ghost would likely materialize to oppose them. The frustration reached its peak during 1943 when Enterprise, after receiving repairs and upgrades at Pearl Harbor including new anti-aircraft weapons and radar systems, returned to combat with even greater lethality. Admiral Manichi Koga, who succeeded Yamamoto after his death in April 1943, issued specific orders that Enterprise was to be targeted for destruction at every opportunity, allocating disproportionate resources to eliminate this single ship. Japanese pilots were briefed with recognition silhouettes of Enterprise, memorizing her distinctive profile with the large number 6 painted on her flight deck, and squadron commanders emphasized that sinking the Gray Ghost would be worth losing an entire air group. But Enterprise seemed to lead a charmed life, participating in the Gilbert Islands campaign, the Marshall Islands invasion, and strikes on Truk, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, without suffering serious damage. Japanese defenders at Kwajalein reported with disbelief as Enterprise's aircraft methodically destroyed shore installations, shipping, and aircraft despite intense anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition. Commander Yasunaka Zono, leading fighter defenses in the Marshalls, noted that his pilots had become reluctant to engage Enterprise's fighters, believing the American ship somehow endowed her aircraft with supernatural protection. The reality was more prosaic but equally demoralizing. Enterprise's air group had become the most experienced and lethal in the Pacific, with many pilots having over a year of combat experience against green Japanese replacements. The Marianas Campaign of June 1944 brought Enterprise to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese mobile fleet in what would be the last major carrier battle Japan could mount. With 9 carriers against 15 American, Ozawa hoped weight of numbers might finally eliminate Enterprise, but the battle became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot as American fighters, many from Enterprise, slaughtered 365 Japanese aircraft while losing only 29. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, one of the few surviving Japanese pilots, reported that Enterprise's fighters seemed to anticipate every Japanese move, appearing exactly where needed to break up attack formations before they could reach American carriers. Admiral Ozawa, watching his carefully hoarded aircraft and pilots disappear in flames, knew Japan's carrier aviation was finished as an offensive force. In his after-action report, he specifically noted Enterprise's role in the destruction, observing that this single ship had been present at every major Japanese defeat from Midway onward, a malevolent spirit that seemed to embody American determination. German naval liaison officers in Tokyo, reading translated Japanese reports, noted the almost superstitious dread that Enterprise inspired in Japanese naval circles, comparing it to British reactions to German battleship Bismarck before her destruction. October 1944 brought Enterprise to Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, where Japan gambled its remaining fleet in a desperate attempt to stop the American return to the Philippines. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the powerful center force that included super battleships Yamato and Musashi, knew Enterprise operated somewhere in the Philippine Sea and allocated specific squadrons to find and destroy her once and for all. But Enterprise's aircraft found Kurita first, joining strikes that sank Musashi with multiple bomb and torpedo hits, destroying what Japanese propaganda had proclaimed the most powerful battleship ever built. The Imperial Japanese Navy's final desperate weapon emerged in October 1944. The Kamikaze, divine wind attacks by pilots who would deliberately crash their bomb-laden aircraft into American ships. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, creator of the Kamikaze Corps, specifically designated Enterprise as a priority target, believing that destroying the Grey Ghost would inspire Japanese forces and demoralize the Americans. On November 25, 1944, the first kamikaze aimed at Enterprise struck home, crashing into her flight deck and killing 15 men. But again the carrier survived what should have been a fatal blow, returning to action within hours. The kamikaze pilots, many barely trained teenagers, were briefed that Enterprise had survived everything conventional attacks could deliver, making suicide attacks the only option. Lieutenant Yukio Seiki, leader of the first organized kamikaze unit, told his pilots that sinking Enterprise would be worth all their lives, as this one ship had caused more damage to Japan than entire American fleets. But Enterprise's crew had learned from 4 years of war, and gunners knocked down kamikaze after kamikaze, the carrier's 5-inch and 40mm guns creating walls of steel that few attackers could penetrate. Still, some got through, and on March 18, 1945, another kamikaze struck Enterprise, but once again she survived. The final act of Enterprise's war came on May 14, 1945, off Okinawa, where Lieutenant Junior Grade Shunsuke Tomiyasu of the 6th Tsukuba Special Attack Squadron made his death dive in a Mitsubishi A6M50 fighter. Tomiyasu, born in Nagasaki Prefecture in 1922, had trained specifically to attack carriers, studying recognition charts of Enterprise until he could identify her silhouette instantly. His squadron mates later reported he had sworn a personal oath to Emperor Hirohito to destroy the Grey Ghost, writing in his final letter home that sinking Enterprise would partially avenge the countless Japanese warriors she had sent to their deaths. Tomiyasu's approach was masterful, using cloud cover to evade radar detection and avoiding the concentrated anti-aircraft fire from Enterprise's screening destroyers. At 0656 hours, he rolled his Zero inverted and dove toward Enterprise's flight deck, the rising sun insignia on his wings catching the morning light. The kamikaze crashed through the forward flight deck near the elevator, his aircraft's bomb detonating in a massive explosion that blasted the elevator platform over 400 feet into the air. 14 Americans died and 68 were wounded as fires raged through the forward section of the ship, And for a few moments it seemed Tomiyasu had finally achieved what 4 years of Japanese efforts had failed to accomplish. But Enterprise's damage control parties, veterans of dozens of battles, responded with practiced efficiency, containing the fires and preventing the explosion from reaching aviation fuel stores. Within hours, the carrier was operational enough to recover aircraft, though her forward elevator was destroyed beyond repair. Captain Grover Hall, who had assumed command in January, recommended withdrawing for repairs, and Enterprise departed for Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, ending her combat career not in a blaze of destruction but with another survival, another resurrection that added to her legend. The news of Enterprise's survival from Tomiyasu's attack reached Admiral Somu Toyota, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, at his headquarters in Tokyo. Toyota, who had succeeded Koga after his death in 1944, simply shook his head in resignation, telling his staff that Enterprise seemed protected by American gods, immune to every weapon Japan possessed. The psychological impact on remaining Japanese forces was devastating, as even kamikaze attacks, the ultimate expression of Japanese warrior spirit, could not sink the gray ghost. German observers noted that Japanese naval officers spoke of Enterprise with a mixture of respect and superstitious dread, as if she were not merely a ship but some manifestation of American industrial might and determination. The statistics compiled by Japanese naval intelligence were staggering and demoralizing. Enterprise had participated in nearly every major Pacific battle, from Pearl Harbor to Okinawa, earning 20 battle stars, more than any other American warship. Her aircraft and guns had destroyed 911 Japanese aircraft, sunk 71 ships, and damaged or destroyed 192 more vessels, from submarines to battleships. She had survived bombs, torpedoes, and kamikaze attacks that should have sent her to the bottom multiple times. Yet she always returned, always survived, always appeared where Japanese forces least expected or wanted to encounter her. Admiral Kichisaburo Nomura, former Japanese ambassador to the United States, reviewing the war after Japan's surrender, identified Enterprise as the single most important American ship in the Pacific War, not just for her combat record but for her psychological impact on Japanese forces. Every time Radio Tokyo announced her sinking, only to have her reappear in another battle, Japanese morale suffered another blow, reinforcing the belief that Japan was fighting not just American technology but something larger, some force that protected certain ships and doomed others. The Gray Ghost had become a metaphor for American resilience, absorbing tremendous punishment but always returning to fight. The Italian Navy's historical section, analyzing Pacific naval battles after the war, noted that Enterprise's survival rate defied statistical probability, suggesting that American damage control techniques, crew training, and construction standards had created a ship that was essentially unsinkable by 1940s weapons technology. Italian naval architects studied Enterprise's design, particularly her subdivision into hundreds of watertight compartments, and her multiple redundant systems that allowed her to continue operating even with severe damage. But they concluded that design alone couldn't explain her survival. It required an exceptional crew, exceptional leadership, and perhaps exceptional luck. German naval analysts, reviewing captured Japanese records, found repeated references to Enterprise in operational planning documents, with some Japanese commanders allocating more resources to destroying this single ship than to entire task forces. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the German Kriegsmarine, observed that Enterprise had achieved something his U-boats never could. She had become a psychological weapon as powerful as her physical armament, a ship whose mere presence could alter enemy planning and morale. The Germans noted that Japanese pilots often reported attacking Enterprise even when she was hundreds of miles away, so obsessed had they become with destroying the Gray Ghost. Commander Mitsuru Yoshida, a Japanese naval author who survived the war, wrote extensively about Enterprise in his post-war memoirs, calling her the nemesis of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a ship that seemed to embody every Japanese fear about American power. He calculated that Enterprise alone had inflicted more damage on Japanese forces than most nations' entire navies achieved during the war, and her survival through 20 major battles defied every principle of naval warfare. Yoshida interviewed dozens of Japanese veterans who had attacked Enterprise, finding a common theme of frustration and disbelief that one ship could absorb so much punishment and continue fighting. The final indignity for Japanese naval pride came when Enterprise survived the war entirely, returning to New York for Navy Day celebrations on October 27, 1945, where she was toured by hundreds of thousands of Americans celebrating victory. Admiral Takeo Takagi, reviewing the final casualty reports, noted with bitter irony that Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers at Midway, where Enterprise played a crucial role, 3 more at Philippine Sea, and ultimately every carrier in the combined fleet, while Enterprise, the ship they had tried hardest to destroy, survived them all. She had outlived Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and every other Japanese carrier that had started the war. The British Admiralty, in an unprecedented gesture, awarded Enterprise the Admiralty Pennant on November 23, 1945, the first time this honor had been given to a non-Royal Navy vessel. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, First Sea Lord, noted that Enterprise's record was unparalleled in naval history, having survived more major actions and inflicted more damage on enemy forces than any other single warship. British Naval Intelligence, comparing Enterprise's record to their own carriers, concluded that she had proven the effectiveness of American construction methods and damage control training, lessons the Royal Navy would incorporate into post-war carrier design. The mystery of Enterprise's survival continued to perplex Japanese naval officers even after the war. Vice Admiral Mato Magaki, who served as Yamamoto's chief of staff, wrote in his diary that Enterprise seemed protected by fate, always appearing where needed, always surviving what should have been fatal damage, always returning to haunt Japanese operations. He calculated that Japanese forces had dropped over 1,000 bombs aimed at Enterprise and fired dozens of torpedoes at her. Yet she survived everything, a ghost that couldn't be exorcised. The psychological impact of this single ship on Japanese naval planning and morale was, Ugaki concluded, worth several divisions of troops. Captain Toshikazu Ami, a Japanese naval strategist, conducted a post-war analysis of Enterprise's combat record, trying to understand how one ship could have such an oversized impact on the war. He concluded that Enterprise had become more than just a warship. She was a symbol of American determination, a rallying point for American forces, and a nightmare for Japanese planners who had to assume she would appear in any major operation. Ami calculated that Japan allocated approximately 30% more air resources to attacks where Enterprise was suspected to be present, a disproportionate response that weakened Japanese efforts elsewhere. The final Japanese assessment of Enterprise came from Emperor Hirohito himself, who in private conversations after the surrender, asked his naval advisors how one American ship had survived everything the Imperial Navy could throw at her. Admiral Shigetaro Shimada, former Navy minister, could only reply that Enterprise seemed to embody the American spirit that Japan had underestimated, a combination of technology, training, and determination that made her virtually indestructible. The Emperor, noting the irony, observed that Japan had started the war believing in spiritual power over material strength, yet it was an American ship that seemed to possess supernatural protection. Lieutenant General Torishiro Kawabe of the Imperial Japanese Army, reviewing joint operations with the Navy, noted that Army commanders had also become aware of Enterprise's reputation, with soldiers on isolated islands scanning the skies whenever American aircraft appeared, wondering if they came from the Gray Ghost. The psychological warfare aspect of Enterprise's survival was perhaps her greatest weapon, Kawabe concluded, as Japanese forces began to believe they were fighting not just the United States Navy but something larger, some force that protected certain ships and doomed others to destruction regardless of Japanese courage or skill. The German Wehrmacht's historical section, analyzing Pacific operations for lessons applicable to the European theater, noted that Enterprise represented something unique in naval warfare, a single ship that had become a strategic asset through survival rather than firepower. They compared her to the German battleship Tirpitz, which tied down British resources simply by existing, but noted that Enterprise went further, actively participating in nearly every major battle while somehow avoiding destruction. German analysts concluded that Enterprise proved the effectiveness of carrier warfare when properly executed, validating pre-war theories about naval aviation that Germany had never been able to test. In the end, USS Enterprise CV-6 survived not through luck or supernatural protection, but through the skill and determination of her crew, the effectiveness of American damage control techniques, and perhaps most importantly, the psychological impact her survival had on enemy forces. Every time Japanese commanders reported her sunk, only to face her aircraft in the next battle, their confidence eroded a little more, their pilots became a little less aggressive, their planning a little more cautious. Enterprise had become more than steel and armor. She was a legend, a ghost that haunted Japanese operations from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay. The final irony came in 1958 when Enterprise, the ship Japan couldn't sink with bombs, torpedoes, or kamikaze attacks, was sold for scrap to the Lipset Corporation of New York City, broken up for steel despite efforts by veterans and historians to preserve her as a memorial. Admiral Arleigh Burke, Chief of Naval Operations, called it a national tragedy that the most decorated ship in American naval history couldn't be saved. But perhaps it was fitting that Enterprise, the gray ghost that had haunted Japanese nightmares for 4 years, simply faded away rather than rusting at a pier. Her legacy lived on in the nuclear carrier USS Enterprise CV-6, commissioned in 1961, and later in the fictional Starship Enterprise of television fame. But for the Japanese naval officers who had tried so desperately to sink her, USS Enterprise CV-6 remained the ship that wouldn't die, the gray ghost that materialized from Pacific mists to strike before vanishing again, leaving only burning wreckage and shattered Japanese hopes in her wake. 20 battle stars, 911 enemy aircraft destroyed, 71 ships sunk, 192 damaged or destroyed, and through it all, Enterprise survived everything Japan threw at her, a testament to American engineering, crew training, and perhaps most importantly, the psychological power of a ship that refused to sink no matter how many times her enemies proclaimed her dead. She was, in every sense, unsinkable not because she couldn't be damaged, but because her crew wouldn't let her die, and that determination, more than armor or weapons, made USS Enterprise CV-6 the most feared ship in the Imperial Japanese Navy.